What would you do if the world around you constantly tried to tear you down? In this heartwarming and emotionally charged story, we follow Ethan, a brilliant young man from a humble background, and his mother, Sarah, a street vendor who has sacrificed everything to give him a better life. Together, they face years of bullying, cruelty, and humiliation from the wealthy students at Hillside Academy. But when one devastating public incident goes too far, Ethan decides to fight back, not just for himself but for the mother who has always been his greatest strength. Will justice prevail, or will the powerful families of his tormentors crush their fight for dignity? This is a story of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. Want to know what happens next? Subscribe to the channel and comment below what you think Ethan and Sarah will do to seek justice. Don't miss the powerful conclusion to this emotional journey. Sarah Andrews had always been a woman of strength, but the past 17 years had pushed her far beyond what she ever thought she could endure. Life had not been kind to her. She had lost her husband, James, to a sudden illness when she was 6 months pregnant with their first and only child. The devastating blow of losing him, her partner and best friend, came like a wave that nearly drowned her. Grief consumed her. But there was no time to wallow in despair, not with a baby on the way. James had been the primary breadwinner, and when he passed, Sarah was left with little more than a pile of bills and the empty space he once occupied in their small apartment in Austin, Texas. She had never imagined herself in such a position, alone, scared, and with so many burdens weighing her down. But one thing was clear to her from the moment she heard the heartbeat of her unborn child: she would not give up. She could not give up. Ethan would be her world, her motivation to keep moving forward, even when life seemed unbearable. After James's death, Sarah took up whatever work she could find. Initially, she worked as a cleaner at a local diner, scrubbing floors and wiping down tables long after the last customer had left. The hours were long and grueling, but she persevered. With a baby on the way, she knew she needed something more stable, so she began experimenting with making sweets, something her grandmother had taught her during her childhood summers spent in a small Texas town. It was a skill she had never thought would become her lifeline. Her first batch of peanut brittle sold out quickly at the local farmer's market. Encouraged by the success, Sarah expanded her offerings, creating caramel clusters, chocolate truffles, and cinnamon rolls. Soon enough, her homemade treats became a small source of income, though the money was never enough to do more than cover the essentials. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself. She had imagined raising Ethan with James by her side, sharing the joys and challenges of parenthood, planning vacations, watching their son grow up in a home filled with laughter. Instead, she was living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, struggling to make ends meet while doing her best to raise Ethan on her own. But she never let Ethan see her struggle. To him, she was always a source of unwavering love and optimism, always reminding him that better days lay ahead. Ethan was her pride and joy. From the moment he was born, she knew there was something special about him. He had a quiet determination even as a baby, and as he grew older, that determination only intensified. He excelled in school from a young age, his thirst for knowledge driving him to achieve academic success that no one in their family had ever known. By the time Ethan reached high school, his brilliance had earned him a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious private schools in Austin, Hillside Academy. It was an opportunity neither Sarah nor Ethan had ever dreamed of, but it came with its own set of challenges. Hillside Academy was a world of privilege, filled with students who came from wealthy, influential families. They arrived at school in brand new cars, dressed in designer clothes, their lives seemingly untouched by the struggles Sarah and Ethan faced every day. Sarah had been both thrilled and terrified when Ethan was accepted. She knew he had the intellect to thrive there, but she worried about how he would handle being surrounded by so much wealth and entitlement, so far removed from their own modest life. Ethan assured her he would be fine, that he would focus on his studies and not let the wealth gap affect him, but Sarah knew her son too well. Deep down, he wanted to fit in, even if he wouldn't admit it. Ethan was proud of his mother. He admired her strength, her determination, her willingness to sacrifice everything for him. But at school, things were different. He never spoke about his home life, never mentioned his mother's business selling sweets on street corners and at local fairs. He kept to himself, focusing on his studies, working hard to prove to himself and to the world that he belonged at Hillside, despite his humble background. Hillside Academy was like another universe to Ethan. The sprawling campus, complete with manicured lawns, marble staircases, and a gleaming library that seemed to stretch into infinity, was worlds apart from the public schools he had attended before. At first, it felt like walking into a dream, but dreams could quickly turn into nightmares. Ethan had earned his spot at Hillside through sheer hard work, but it didn't take long for him to realize that, to some of his classmates, merit meant nothing without money. For them, wealth was the measure of worth, and by that standard, Ethan didn't measure up. It began with subtle things, snide comments about his clothes, which were always clean but never fashionable, the whispers behind his back when he pulled out his old, slightly cracked phone, a relic compared to the sleek new models his classmates flashed around. At first, Ethan tried to shrug it off. What did it matter if he didn't wear designer shoes or carry the latest smartphone? He was here to learn, not to impress anyone. But it wasn't long before the teasing escalated. "Hey, Ethan," Jacob Hill called out one afternoon as they waited for their teacher to arrive. Jacob was one of the most popular boys at Hillside, his family known for their vast real estate empire. He had a cocky, self-assured way of carrying himself, as if the world already belonged to him. His friend Ryan Davis stood beside him, smirking. "Your phone's looking a little outdated," Jacob said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Don't you think it's time for an upgrade? Or are you waiting for the next charity drive to get something a little newer?" Ryan snickered, and Ethan felt his face flush with embarrassment. He had learned not to react when they teased him. It only gave them more ammunition, but the comments stung all the same. "I don't need a new phone," Ethan said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "This one works fine." "Sure it does," Jacob said, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, who needs a camera that actually takes clear pictures, right? You're not trying to impress anyone anyway." Ryan chuckled again, and Ethan felt his hands clench into fists under the desk. He knew they were trying to get a rise out of him, and he refused to give them satisfaction. But each comment, each cruel jab, chipped away at his confidence, leaving him feeling more and more out of place in a world where money seemed to mean everything. Hillside wasn't just a school, it was a showcase. Students paraded around in the latest fashions, their conversations filled with talk of weekend getaways, luxury vacations, and shopping sprees. For many of them, academics were secondary to social status. Ethan, on the other hand, buried himself in his studies. He didn't have the luxury of coasting through life. He couldn't afford to be anything less than exceptional. But as much as Ethan tried to focus on his academics, the social pressures were always there, gnawing at him. He spent lunch periods alone, preferring the quiet of the library to the cacophony of the cafeteria, where Jacob, Ryan, and their friends ruled over their tables like kings. He knew his silence only made him more of a target, but he didn't care. He had come to Hillside to build a future, not to make friends. Still, no matter how much he tried to ignore them, the weight of their mockery lingered. Every time he heard the snickers, every time he saw the way they looked at him, as if he were an intruder in their world, it chipped away at his self-esteem. Hillside Academy might have been his gateway to success, but at times it felt like a prison he couldn't escape. While Ethan fought his own battles at school, Sarah waged her daily war on the streets of Austin. Her spot on the corner of 5th and Main had become her second home, a place where she set up her small cart filled with sweets, hoping to catch the attention of passers-by. The early mornings were always the hardest. Sarah would wake before dawn, her hands moving automatically through the motions she had practiced for years. She mixed ingredients in her tiny kitchen, the smells of caramel and chocolate filling the air. With each stir of the pot, each carefully crafted piece of candy, she poured her love and determination into her work. The kitchen was old, the countertops worn from years of use, but it was hers. It was where she created the little pieces of sweetness that would, she hoped, carry them through another day. Her body ached from years of labor, her back sore from standing, her fingers stiff from hours of shaping brittle and rolling truffles. But she never let it slow her down. She couldn't. She had to keep moving, keep working. Ethan's future depended on it. When she arrived at her spot, she would set up her cart with the precision of a seasoned professional. The cart was small but brightly painted, with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Sarah's Sweet Treats, made with love." She had painted it herself years ago when she had first started selling her sweets on the streets. Back then, it had been a labor of love, a way to bring a little bit of joy to her customers. Now, it was a lifeline. Some days were good. On sunny afternoons, the foot traffic was heavy and people would stop buying a caramel or cinnamon roll. Office workers on their lunch breaks, parents with children in tow, even tourists passing through would be drawn to the sweet smells coming from her cart. "Good morning, would you like to try a sample?" Sarah would call out, her voice bright and cheerful, even when her body screamed with exhaustion. She had learned that a smile and a kind word could go a long way in drawing customers to her cart. But not every day was sunny. There were days when the rain would come pouring down, drenching her cart and chasing potential customers away. On those days, Sarah would huddle under a small umbrella, her eyes scanning the empty streets, praying for just a few sales to make the day worthwhile. She couldn't afford to have too many slow days, not with rent due, not with bills piling up. And then there were the people who didn't stop for sweets but for something far crueler. Sarah had learned to develop thick skin, but some comments still cut deep. "Why don't you get a real job?" One man sneered as he walked by one rainy afternoon, barely glancing at her as he pulled his designer coat tighter around himself. "Selling candy on the street? How pathetic." Another woman, clutching a leather handbag that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, looked down her nose at the cart. "You really think people want to buy food from someone like you? With those hands?" she said, her tone dripping with disdain as she gestured toward Sarah's calloused fingers. Sarah forced a smile, though the comments stung. "My hands may be rough, but the sweets are made with care," she replied calmly. She had long ago learned that responding with kindness was the only way to keep her dignity intact. No matter how much it hurt, she wouldn't let anyone make her feel ashamed of the work she did. The cruel words echoed in her mind as she walked home each evening, her cart creaking behind her. But when she reached the door to their apartment and saw Ethan waiting for her with a smile on his face, the weight of the day's insults faded away. It was all for him. Every hour she spent on her feet, every insult she swallowed, every sacrifice she made, it was all for Ethan. Ethan sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the pages of his textbook, but the words blurred together in his mind. His thoughts kept drifting back to school, to the way Jacob and Ryan laughed at him that afternoon. No matter how much he tried to focus on his studies, the sound of their mocking voices echoed in his head, drowning out everything else. His bedroom was small, the furniture old and worn, but it was his sanctuary. It was the one place where he could escape from the pressures of Hillside Academy, from the relentless feeling of being out of place. Here, he could lose himself in his books, in the equations and theories that he had always loved. But lately, even that escape seemed elusive. The shame was eating at him, creeping into every corner of his mind. He had worked so hard to get where he was, studying late into the night, sacrificing weekends and social events to keep his grades up. But no amount of hard work could change the fact that he didn't fit in at Hillside. The other students wore their wealth like armor, and no matter how hard he tried to blend in, Ethan always felt exposed. He didn't care about their clothes, their cars, or their fancy gadgets. What hurt was the way they looked at him, the way they dismissed him as if he were less than them because of where he came from. He could handle the jokes about his phone, his clothes, even his quiet demeanor, but when they started mocking his mother, it was too much. They didn't know her. They didn't know how hard she worked, how many sacrifices she made just so he could be where he was. They didn't see the nights she stayed up late, preparing sweets for the next day, her hands raw from hours of work. They didn't know how much she had given up so that he could have a chance at a better life. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger rise in his chest. He hated how powerless he felt. No matter how well he did in school, no matter how hard he tried to prove himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that he would never be good enough in their eyes. "Ethan?" His mother's voice drifted in from the living room, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Dinner's ready." Ethan took a deep breath, forcing the anger down. "Coming, Mom," he called back, closing his textbook and standing up. He walked into the small kitchen where Sarah was setting the table with their modest meal, pasta with tomato sauce, simple but hearty. She smiled at him as he sat down, her eyes filled with warmth and love. "How was school today?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with the usual undercurrent of concern. Ethan hesitated for a moment, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. He didn't want to burden her with his problems, not when she was already carrying so much. "It was fine," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." Sarah studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. She always had a way of seeing through him, of knowing when something was wrong, even when he tried to hide it. But she didn't push him. Instead, she reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "I know it's hard," she said softly. "But you're doing great, Ethan. You're so much stronger than you realize." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, his heart aching with gratitude for her. She had always been his biggest supporter, the one person who believed in him no matter what. But lately, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was letting her down. "Thanks, Mom," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. They ate in silence for a while. The soft clinking of forks against plates was the only sound in the room. But even as they shared the quiet meal, the weight of Ethan's inner turmoil remained heavy on his shoulders. The spring sun shone brightly over Hillside Academy as Ethan made his way through the pristine halls, books clutched to his chest. The annual charity auction was set to take place that evening, and the school buzzed with anticipation. Students whispered excitedly about their designer outfits and the lavish items that would be auctioned off. Ethan, however, felt a tightening knot in his stomach. The charity auction was a major event on the school's calendar, attended by not just students, but their wealthy parents, school benefactors, and local elites. It was an occasion where Hillside's students displayed not just their academic achievements, but their family wealth and status. Ethan had attended the previous year and had never felt more out of place. While his classmates bid on extravagant vacations and rare memorabilia, he sat quietly at the back of the room, thankful that no one noticed his discomfort. This year he had planned to skip the event entirely, but the school had other ideas. As one of the top-performing students, Ethan had been asked to attend and help with the logistics of the event. He was supposed to help set up the tables, ensure the seating arrangements were in order, and assist the staff with last-minute preparations. He agreed, if only to avoid standing out for refusing to participate. As the day wore on, Ethan tried to keep his focus on the tasks at hand. But as the event drew closer, the familiar sense of dread settled in his chest. He had overheard Jacob and Ryan earlier, joking about how much they would bid on various auction items. To them, the event was just another opportunity to flaunt their wealth. To Ethan, it was a reminder of how different his life was from theirs. That evening, the gymnasium was transformed into a luxurious ballroom, complete with chandeliers, white tablecloths, and sparkling centerpieces. Ethan arrived early, dressed in his best. a simple button-down shirt and slacks that Sarah had pressed for him. He helped the event staff set up the tables, his eyes darting nervously around the room as the first guests began to arrive. The women wore elegant gowns, their necks adorned with diamonds, while the men strolled in wearing tailored suits. Ethan felt like a ghost, invisible among the well-dressed crowd. He was busy arranging the final touches on one of the auction tables when a familiar voice cut through the room. "Well, look who it is. Ethan Andrews, the auction helper." Jacob's voice rang out with mock enthusiasm. Ethan didn't look up. He pretended not to hear as he finished adjusting the items on display. Jacob, however, wasn't easily discouraged. He sauntered over, Ryan close behind him, both boys dressed in designer suits that probably cost more than Ethan's rent. "Nice of you to pitch in," Jacob said, leaning against the table, his tone laced with condescension. "Though I guess that's the closest you'll get to being a part of this event, right? Helping set up for the people who can actually afford to be here." Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. He had learned to let their words roll off him, but tonight it felt harder than usual. Maybe it was the weight of the event, or maybe it was the way Jacob and Ryan always seemed to find a way to make him feel like an outsider. Either way, he could feel his composure slipping. "I'm just doing my part," Ethan said quietly, finally looking up. "It's a charity event after all." Jacob smirked. "Yeah, charity for people like you, right? You should be grateful we're even letting you help out. Not everyone gets a front row seat to watch how the other half lives." Ryan chuckled, adding, "You can probably learn a thing or two about how to make some real money tonight. Who knows, maybe one day you'll even get to bid on something." The blood pounded in Ethan's ears, and he could feel the heat of anger rising in his chest. But before he could say anything, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it, grateful for the distraction. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the message. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm just a few minutes away. I thought I'd surprise you. Can't wait to see you. Mom." Ethan's stomach dropped. Mom is coming? He hadn't expected her to show up. In fact, he had purposely avoided telling her about the event, not wanting her to feel pressured to attend. And now, knowing that she was on her way, a wave of panic washed over him. What would she think, seeing him in a room full of people like Jacob and Ryan? How would they treat her? He sent a quick reply. "Mom, you didn't have to come. It's not a big deal. I'm just working the event." But it was too late. As the door to the gym opened, he saw her. Sarah walked in, wearing a simple but elegant dress, a deep blue gown that she had bought months ago, saving up bit by bit for this special occasion. Her face lit up with pride when she saw Ethan across the room, and she waved at him enthusiastically, holding a small box of homemade treats she had brought as a gift for the staff. Ethan's heart sank. As much as he loved his mother, he could already feel the stares from around the room. People were looking at her, the way her dress, though beautiful, didn't quite match the high-fashion gowns of the other women, the way her hands were calloused from years of hard work. He could see the judgment in their eyes, even if they didn't say anything aloud. But Jacob and Ryan didn't need to be silent. "Wait, is that your mom?" Jacob asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's really going to bring candy to an event like this? That's so pathetic." Ryan laughed, adding, "She must think she's still selling on the street corner." Ethan's vision blurred with rage. His hands shook, and for a moment, he considered confronting them, shouting back at them, defending his mother's honor. But the words stuck in his throat, suffocated by years of holding back, of keeping quiet, of trying to fit in. He looked over at Sarah again. She hadn't noticed the boy's cruel laughter. She was making her way toward him, her smile bright, her eyes full of love and pride. And all Ethan could feel was shame. Not for her, but for himself, for being too afraid to stand up to them. Before she could reach him, he turned and fled, pushing through the crowd and out the door, leaving Sarah standing there, confused and alone. Ethan ran. his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway as he sprinted out of the gymnasium and into the cool night air. His chest heaved as he gulped down breaths, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the wave of shame that washed over him. He collapsed onto a bench outside the school, burying his face in his hands. His heart pounded in his ears, and he could still hear Jacob and Ryan's cruel laughter echoing in his mind. He had never felt so humiliated in his life. They mocked his mother, the one person in the world who had given everything for him, and he had done nothing to stop them. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them back, refusing to cry. He couldn't cry. Not here, not now. But the pain in his chest was unbearable. It was like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him, making it impossible to breathe. Why had she come? Why couldn't she have just stayed home? He hated himself for even thinking it, but the truth was there, undeniable. He had wanted to protect her from this world, from the cruelty of people like Jacob and Ryan, and now she had walked right into it, completely unaware of the mockery she had been subjected to. His phone buzzed again. It was another message from Sarah. "Ethan, where are you? Is everything okay?" Ethan couldn't bring himself to answer. He couldn't face her. Not after what had happened. Not after the way he had abandoned her in that room. He felt like a coward, a failure. He had promised himself that he would make her proud, that he would prove to the world that their circumstances didn't define them. But tonight, he had done the exact opposite. He sat there for what felt like hours, the cold night air biting at his skin. His mind raced, thoughts spiraling out of control. He couldn't go back in there. He couldn't face Jacob and Ryan, couldn't stand the thought of them laughing at him, mocking him for the rest of the night. But most of all, he couldn't face his mother. How could he explain to her what had happened? How could he tell her that he had let her be humiliated in front of everyone, and that he had done nothing to stop it? Finally, he heard footsteps approaching. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly wiped his eyes, trying to compose himself. When he looked up, he saw Sarah standing in front of him, her face etched with concern. "Ethan," she said softly, sitting down beside him on the bench. "What's wrong?" For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. He couldn't look at her. He stared down at the ground, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. How could he possibly explain what had happened? How could he tell her that he was ashamed not of her but of himself? "They were laughing at you," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "Jacob and Ryan, they said horrible things. They made fun of you. And I didn't do anything. I ran." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion, and then her face softened with understanding. She reached out and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, you don't need to worry about what those boys think," she said, her voice calm and steady. "They don't matter." "But they do matter." Ethan's voice cracked as he finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain. "They made fun of you, Mom. They humiliated you in front of everyone, and I didn't do anything. I just let them." Sarah's expression didn't waver. She had always known that this day would come, the day when Ethan would face the cruelty of the world. She had tried to shield him from it for as long as possible, but now, sitting beside him on that cold bench, she realized that he had been carrying the weight of their circumstances for far too long. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice filled with love, "you didn't let anyone do anything. What those boys said, that's a reflection of them, not you, not me. It doesn't change who we are." Ethan shook his head, his throat tightening with emotion. "But I should have stood up for you. I should have done something." Sarah smiled gently and pulled him into a hug. "You don't need to fight every battle, Ethan. Sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away." Ethan leaned into her embrace, his heart heavy with guilt. He wanted to believe her, but the shame still lingered. He had promised himself that he would protect her, that he would be the one to shield her from the world's cruelty. But tonight, he failed. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah stroked his hair, her heart aching for her son. She had always known that Ethan was different from other boys. His age, more sensitive, more aware of the struggles they faced. But she had never wanted him to carry that burden alone. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she said softly. "You've always been my greatest strength, Ethan. And nothing those boys say or do can ever change that." They sat there in silence for a long time, the night air cool and still around them. Sarah held Ethan close, her heart filled with both pride and sorrow. She knew that this moment, this painful, heart-wrenching moment, would shape him in ways he couldn't yet understand. But she also knew that he was strong, stronger than he realized. And as they sat there, side by side, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, no matter how hard life became, she would always be there for him. She would never let him carry the weight of the world alone. The days following the charity auction were difficult for both Ethan and Sarah. The weight of what had happened lingered in the air between them, unspoken but ever present. Ethan returned to school with a sense of dread, knowing that Jacob and Ryan would be waiting, ready to remind him of his humiliation. And Sarah returned to her usual routine, though the sting of that night remained fresh in her heart. But while Ethan struggled to move forward, Sarah found solace in the familiar rhythm of her work. She had always believed that hard work could heal even the deepest wounds, and so she threw herself into her business with renewed determination. Each morning, Sarah would wake before dawn, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared her sweets. She worked quietly, methodically, allowing the steady movements to clear her mind. As the caramel simmered on the stove and the scent of chocolate filled the air, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was her purpose, her way of providing for Ethan, her way of showing him that no matter how hard life became, they could always find a way to move forward. But the memory of that night, the look on Ethan's face when he told her what had happened, still haunted her. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the shame he felt for something that wasn't his fault. And she knew that, as much as she tried to shield him from the cruelty of the world, there were some battles he would have to face on his own. One evening, as they sat together in their small living room, Ethan was unusually quiet. He stared down at his homework. The pages opened in front of him, but Sarah could see that his mind was elsewhere. She watched him for a moment, her heart heavy with concern. "Ethan," she said softly, breaking the silence. "What's going on?" Ethan looked up, his eyes tired. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "It's just school. Everything feels overwhelming right now." Sarah's heart ached for him. She had always known that Hillside would be a challenge, not just academically, but socially. She had tried to prepare him for it, but nothing could truly prepare someone for the isolation that came with being different. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said gently. "You know that, right?" Ethan nodded, but he didn't say anything. He had always been careful not to burden his mother with his problems. She already had so much to deal with, working long hours, making sure they had enough money to get by. He didn't want to add to her stress, but Sarah could see through him. She had always been able to. "Ethan, you don't have to be strong all the time," she said softly. "It's okay to let people in." Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes filling with unshed tears. I don't want to disappoint you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've given up so much for me, and sometimes I feel like I'm letting you down." Sarah's heart broke at his words. She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You could never let me down, Ethan," she said, her voice firm but filled with love. "You are my greatest achievement. Everything I do is because I believe in you. And I know you're going to do great things, but you don't have to carry that weight on your own. I'm here with you, always." Ethan blinked, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I just want to make you proud." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with love for her son. "You already have," she whispered. With Sarah's words still fresh in his mind, Ethan found a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent too long allowing Jacob and Ryan's cruelty to define him, to dictate how he saw himself. But now, as graduation approached, he realized that he had the power to change that narrative. The school had chosen Ethan to give the graduation speech, a prestigious honor that recognized his academic achievements. But Ethan knew that the speech was more than just a formality. It was his chance to finally speak his truth, to stand up for himself and for his mother, and to show the world that their worth was not defined by their circumstances. Late one night, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the blank page in front of him. He had been asked to write a speech about perseverance and hard work, about the lessons they had learned over the past 4 years. But every time he tried to start, the words felt hollow, meaningless. He couldn't talk about perseverance without talking about his mother. He couldn't talk about hard work without acknowledging the sacrifices she had made for him. And he couldn't talk about the lessons he had learned without addressing the cruelty and injustice he had faced at Hillside. So, instead of writing the speech he thought the school wanted to hear, Ethan wrote the speech that came from his heart. He wrote about Sarah, the woman who had raised him alone, who had worked tirelessly to provide for him, who had never let him give up, even when the world seemed determined to knock them down. He wrote about the nights she stayed up late, preparing sweets in their tiny kitchen, her hands raw from hours of work. He wrote about the mornings she woke before dawn, determined to make enough money to keep them afloat. He wrote about the humiliation he had faced at school, the way Jacob and Ryan had mocked him, belittled him, made him feel like he didn't belong. But most of all, he wrote about resilience, about how, no matter how many times life had tried to break them, he and Sarah had refused to be defeated. When he finally finished, he read the speech aloud to himself, his voice shaking with emotion. It wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration of who he was and of who his mother was. And as he sat there in the quiet of their apartment, he knew that this was the right thing to say. Graduation was his moment, and he would make sure that this time, no one could take it away from him. Graduation day dawned bright and clear, the early morning sun casting a warm glow over the Hillside Academy campus. It was a day of celebration, a day that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For most students, it was a day filled with excitement and pride, a culmination of years of hard work. But for Ethan, the day carried a weight far heavier than most could understand. He awoke with a mixture of nervousness and determination. This was it, his moment, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had spent countless nights preparing for. His graduation speech would be more than just a few words at the podium. It was his chance to finally say what he had held inside for so long, to confront the years of mockery and exclusion, and to honor his mother in front of everyone who had doubted him. Ethan's heart raced as he dressed for the ceremony. He chose his clothes carefully, simple but smart. A crisp white shirt, a navy blue blazer, and slacks. It wasn't as flashy as the designer outfits his classmates would wear, but it was enough. His appearance wasn't the point today. His words were. Sarah was waiting for him in the living room, her eyes brimming with pride as she watched her son prepare for the biggest day of his life. She had put on the same blue dress she had worn to the charity auction, the one that had been ruined in the mud. After that humiliating night, Sarah had carefully cleaned it, restoring the fabric as best she could. It still had faint stains near the hem, but she wore it proudly. To her, it symbolized resilience. "You look so handsome," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe today's the day. My little boy is all grown up." Ethan smiled, but his heart ached. He knew she had sacrificed so much to get him to this moment, and he wanted nothing more than to make her proud. "Thanks, Mom," he murmured, pulling her into a hug. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Sarah held him close, feeling the strength of his shoulders, the maturity he had gained over the years. "You've done more than enough, Ethan. I'm so proud of you. No matter what happens today, just remember that. You've already won." Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were racing. He knew the speech he had prepared would change everything. It was raw, honest, and vulnerable. But it was also a risk. He had no idea how the crowd would react, and a part of him feared the backlash. But another part of him, stronger, fiercer, knew it had to be said. He couldn't keep hiding who he was, where he came from, and what his mother had done for him. As they left the apartment, heading toward the school, Ethan's nerves began to creep in. The streets were already bustling with people, families in their best attire making their way to the ceremony. Hillside Academy was renowned for its grandeur, and graduation was no exception. The event was held in the school's massive auditorium, which had been adorned with flowers, banners, and gold-trimmed decorations. As they approached the school gates, Ethan glanced at his mother. She walked with her head held high, a small smile on her lips, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. No doubt she was remembering the humiliation she had faced at the charity auction, how Jacob and Ryan had pushed her into the mud, how they had mocked her for simply trying to be part of his world. But today was different. Today, she wasn't alone, and neither was he. The auditorium was already filling with students and their families by the time they arrived. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement, and everywhere Ethan looked, he saw flashes of luxury: gold watches, designer shoes, diamond earrings. It was a world that had never felt like his, no matter how hard he tried to fit in. They found their seats near the back of the auditorium, and Sarah settled into her chair with a deep breath. Ethan could see her trying to compose herself, her eyes scanning the room. He knew she was nervous, though she would never admit it. "I'm going to go check in," Ethan said, squeezing her hand gently. "I'll be up there soon." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "You'll do great, Ethan. I know you will." Ethan made his way backstage, where the other student speakers were gathered. The principal, Mr. Sullivan, stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone and giving last-minute instructions. Ethan could feel the tension in the air as the students chatted excitedly, some rehearsing their speeches under their breath. Jacob and Ryan were there too, standing off to the side, laughing with a group of friends. They hadn't noticed Ethan yet, but he could feel their presence like a dark cloud looming over him. Part of him wanted to confront them, to finally tell them off for all the pain they had caused him. But he knew better. Today wasn't about them. It was about his mother. It was about reclaiming his dignity. As the ceremony began, Ethan stood backstage, listening as the names of his classmates were called one by one to receive their diplomas. The sound of applause filled the auditorium, and Ethan's nerves twisted in his gut. His turn was coming soon. He would be the final speaker, the one to close out the ceremony. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier with every passing moment. Finally, it was time. Mr. Sullivan's voice echoed through the auditorium as he introduced Ethan, the valedictorian and the class speaker. "And now to deliver the final remarks of the evening, please welcome Ethan Andrews, an exemplary student and one of our brightest young minds." The applause that followed was polite, though not as enthusiastic as it had been for some of the other students. Ethan knew why. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't from a wealthy family, and he hadn't been part of the social circles that dominated Hillside. But he had earned his place here, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. He stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. The bright lights blinded him momentarily, and for a second, he almost faltered. But then he saw her. Sarah sitting near the back, her face glowing with pride. Her eyes met him, and in that moment, all of his fear melted away. This was for her. Ethan took a deep breath, his hand gripping the edges of the podium as he looked out at the crowd. The sea of faces blurred together for a moment, but his focus remained on one: Sarah. He had written this speech for her, and now, standing before his classmates, their families, and the school faculty, he knew he had made the right decision. "Good evening," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "When I first sat down to write this speech, I struggled with what to say. Graduation speeches are supposed to be about celebrating our achievements, about looking toward the future with optimism. But for me, this day is about something more." The crowd grew quiet, sensing the weight of his words. Ethan's heart raced, but he kept going. "I came to Hillside Academy on a scholarship, like many students here, but unlike most of you, I didn't grow up in a world of wealth and privilege. My mother raised me on her own, working long hours, selling homemade sweets on the streets of Austin to make sure I had what I needed. She gave up everything so that I could be standing here today." Murmurs rippled through the audience, but Ethan ignored them. His gaze remained steady, his voice unwavering. "For years, I've been quiet about my background. I thought if I didn't talk about where I came from, maybe people wouldn't notice how different I was. But the truth is, I can't hide who I am, and I shouldn't have to." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. He could see Jacob and Ryan sitting toward the front, their faces tense, their eyes locked on him. "Good. Let them listen. There are people in this room who have tried to make me feel like I don't belong here," Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger. "They've mocked me for not having the latest phone or the nicest clothes. They've laughed at my mother for the work she does, as if her job is something to be ashamed of. But I'm not ashamed. In fact, I'm proud." His words echoed through the auditorium, each one hitting its mark with precision. "My mother is the strongest person I know. She has faced hardships that many of you will never understand. She worked tirelessly, day in and day out, to give me a future that she could only dream of. And I will never be ashamed of that. I will never be ashamed of where I come from, because where I come from has made me who I am." Ethan's voice trembled slightly, but he kept going, the fire inside him burning brighter with each word. "For too long, I let other people define my worth. I let their words, their laughter, their judgment weigh me down. But not anymore. Today, I'm standing here to tell you all that your worth is not determined by what you have, but by who you are. And I am proud of who I am." The audience was silent, every eye fixed on Ethan. Even the faculty members who had watched him grow over the past 4 years were moved by his words. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart swelling with pride. "I dedicate this speech to my mother, Sarah Andrews," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom, you are my hero. You've shown me what it means to be strong, to never give up, no matter how hard life gets. And everything I do from this day forward is for you." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she listened to her son's words, her heart full to bursting. She had always known that Ethan was special, but hearing him speak those words in front of the entire school, hearing him stand up for her, for himself, was more than she could have ever hoped for. The room erupted into applause, but this time, it wasn't the polite clapping of obligation. It was real, heartfelt, and thunderous. Students, teachers, and parents alike rose to their feet, clapping and cheering for Ethan. He had done it. He had taken back his power. And as he stood on that stage, looking out at the sea of faces, he knew that this was just the beginning. Jacob and Ryan sat frozen in their seats, their faces pale, their mouths set in tight lines. They hadn't expected this. They had never thought that Ethan, the boy they had spent years mocking, would have the courage to call them out in front of everyone. And now they had nowhere to hide. As the applause continued, Ethan stepped away from the podium, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He walked off the stage and made his way down the aisle towards Sarah, who was still standing, clapping through her tears. When he reached her, she pulled him into a tight embrace, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. So proud." Ethan hugged her back, his own eyes wet with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." Together they stood in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by applause. But in that moment, it felt like it was just the two of them, mother and son, side by side, stronger than ever. The aftermath of Ethan's speech rippled through Hillside Academy like a shockwave. By the next morning, everyone was talking about it. Students, parents, teachers, even the headmaster. It wasn't just the words themselves that had caused such a stir, but the raw honesty with which Ethan had delivered them. He had stood on that stage and laid bare the truth, not just about his own life, but about the social divides that had long simmered beneath the surface at Hillside. The immediate response from Ethan's classmates was mixed. Some of them, those who had always stayed quiet while Jacob and Ryan made their cruel jokes, now found themselves questioning their silence. Others, particularly those in Jacob and Ryan's inner circle, were angry and defensive, feeling as though Ethan had unfairly exposed their privilege. And then there were those who, like Ethan, had struggled with feelings of isolation and inadequacy at Hillside. For them, Ethan's speech was a revelation, a validation of everything they had felt but never voiced. As for Jacob and Ryan, their reaction was one of stunned disbelief. The power dynamic they had relied on for years had been shattered in a single night. They had spent so long believing they were untouchable, that their wealth and status would always protect them from consequences. But now, sitting in the aftermath of Ethan's speech, they realized how wrong they had been. The days following graduation were difficult for both boys. Their families, who had once been so proud of their son's success at Hillside, were now deeply ashamed. Jacob's father, a wealthy real estate mogul, was furious when he learned what had happened. He had built his business on a foundation of respect and professionalism, and now his son's behavior threatened to tarnish that reputation. "You've humiliated this family," Mr. Hill spat one evening, pacing back and forth in his office as Jacob sat, head down in front of him. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? How this reflects on me, on our name? I didn't work my entire life to have it all undone by your stupidity." Jacob remained silent, his face pale. He had never seen his father this angry before. Mr. Hill was known for his cool demeanor, his ability to negotiate and close deals without ever raising his voice. But this was different. This was personal. "We'll fix this," Mr. Hill continued, though his voice had lost some of its fury. "We'll issue a public apology, donate to the school, whatever it takes to make this go away." But as much as Jacob wanted to believe that a few apologies and a check would solve the problem, he knew it wasn't that simple. The damage was done. People had seen him for what he truly was, a bully, and no amount of money could change that. Ryan's family reacted in much the same way. His mother, who had always doted on him, was heartbroken when she learned what had happened. She had raised Ryan to be kind, to respect others, and to always show empathy. But somewhere along the way, her son had lost sight of those values, caught up in the toxic culture of privilege that permeated Hillside. "I don't know what to say to you," Mrs. Davis said one afternoon. Her voice was heavy with disappointment. "I thought I raised you better than this. I thought you were better than this." Ryan had never felt so small, so utterly ashamed of himself. His mother's words cut deeper than any punishment ever could. He had always sought her approval, had always wanted to make her proud. But now, standing in the wake of his actions, he realized how far he had strayed from the person she had wanted him to be. Both boys were forced to publicly apologize, not just to Ethan and Sarah, but to the entire school. Their apologies were broadcast during a special assembly, with parents and faculty present. Jacob stood at the podium, his voice shaky as he read from a prepared statement. Ryan followed, his face flushed with humiliation as he stumbled over his words. The apologies were formal, rehearsed, but the impact was undeniable. For the first time, they were forced to confront the consequences of their actions in a way that couldn't be brushed aside. But apologies weren't enough. Not for Ethan, not for Sarah. Though Ethan had reclaimed his dignity with his graduation speech, the emotional wounds from years of bullying still festered. And as much as Sarah tried to move on, she couldn't forget the cruelty she had endured, especially on the day of the charity auction when Jacob and Ryan had humiliated her in front of everyone. It wasn't just about words anymore. It was about accountability. One evening, a few weeks after the graduation ceremony, Sarah sat across from Ethan at their small kitchen table. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden light across the room. They had been talking about his plans for college. Ethan had been accepted into a prestigious university on a full scholarship, but Sarah could tell something was weighing on him. "You've been quiet tonight," Sarah said, reaching out to gently squeeze his hand. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, his brow furrowed as he looked down at the table. "I've been thinking about everything, about what happened at school, with Jacob and Ryan, and with you." Sarah's heart ached at the mention of that night. She had tried to push it from her mind, tried to focus on the fact that Ethan had come out stronger, but the memory of being shoved into the mud, of being laughed at, still stung. I don't think it's enough," Ethan continued, his voice low. "The apologies, the assembly, it's not enough. They should be held accountable for what they did. Not just to me, but to you." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this. "Ethan, I appreciate that, but I don't want to stir things up again. We've moved on." "No, Mom," Ethan said, shaking his head. "We haven't moved on. We've just buried it. And I can't let them get away with what they did to you. I can't let them think that just saying sorry makes it all go away." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching her son's face. She could see the determination in his eyes, the fire that had been ignited during his speech. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for her. For the woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed so much for him. "What are you thinking?" she finally asked. "I think we should take legal action," Ethan said, his voice firm but quiet. His gaze never wavered as he watched his mother's reaction. Sarah sat back in her chair, momentarily stunned. Legal action? It wasn't something she had ever considered. Despite everything Jacob and Ryan had done, she had resigned herself to enduring the pain, as she had done with so many other hardships. But seeing the fire in her son's eyes, she realized this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for everything they had gone through. Ethan wasn't asking for revenge. He was seeking justice, not just for himself, but for her as well. "Ethan," Sarah's voice was soft, uncertain. "A lawsuit? That's a big step. I don't know if we—" "Mom, we can't just let them get away with this," Ethan interrupted gently. "What they did to you, to us, it's not right, and it's not just about the apologies. It's about making sure they understand the consequences of their actions. You were humiliated, and I was bullied for years. We've fought so hard to get here, I think it's time to fight back." Sarah was quiet, absorbing his words. Part of her wanted to protect Ethan from the potential backlash of a legal battle. She had seen enough of the world to know that standing up to powerful, wealthy families like the Hills and Davises could be dangerous. But another part of her, the part that had been quietly enduring years of hardship, humiliation, and injustice, was tired of staying silent. She had taught Ethan to be strong, to stand up for what was right. How could she now tell him to let this go, when she knew deep down that he was right? "Do you really think we have a chance?" Sarah asked softly, her voice laced with worry. Ethan nodded, his determination unwavering. "We do. I've been reading up on cases like this. They can't just use their wealth to brush this aside. And there are laws that protect people from bullying, harassment, and public humiliation. We deserve to at least try." Sarah exhaled slowly, her mind racing. It was a huge step. But looking at Ethan, seeing the resolve in his eyes, the strength she had always believed he possessed, she knew that this was their moment. They had both been pushed down for too long. Maybe it was time to push back. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady. "Let's do it. Let's fight." The next morning, Sarah and Ethan began the process of finding a lawyer. It wasn't easy. They didn't have the same financial resources as the Hills and Davises, but after a few calls, they were connected with a small but reputable law firm that specialized in cases involving bullying, harassment, and defamation. It wasn't a flashy firm, but it had a track record of standing up for clients who had been wronged. Their attorney, Ms. Lisa Hamilton, was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s with a reputation for taking on difficult cases. She listened carefully as Sarah and Ethan explained the years of bullying, the humiliation they had endured, and the specific incidents involving Jacob and Ryan. When they finished, Ms. Hamilton leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. "This is definitely a strong case," she said thoughtfully. "Bullying and harassment in schools, especially from students with significant social and financial power, is something courts are starting to take more seriously. And the public humiliation aspect, particularly what happened to you, Ms. Andrews, during that charity event, that's where we can focus. The way they treated you wasn't just cruel, it was defamatory and malicious." "But will they take us seriously?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying the doubt she still felt. "They have so much money, they'll fight us with everything they've got." Ms. Hamilton gave her a reassuring smile. "That may be true, but the law is on our side here. This isn't about how much money they have, it's about justice, and I believe we can get it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and preparations. Ms. Hamilton filed the lawsuit against both Jacob and Ryan for public humiliation, defamation, and harassment. The lawsuit wasn't just about financial compensation, though that was part of it. More importantly, it was about holding the boys accountable for their actions, both legally and publicly. When the news broke that Sarah and Ethan had filed a lawsuit, it spread quickly through the Hillside community. The reactions were immediate and intense. Some parents, particularly those who had been sympathetic to Ethan's speech at graduation, expressed support, recognizing the courage it took to stand up to such powerful families. Others, however, were outraged, viewing the lawsuit as an attack on Hillside's reputation and the privileged students who attended the school. Jacob and Ryan's families, predictably, were furious. "What do you mean they're suing us?" Mr. Hill had practically shouted when Jacob told him the news. He was in the middle of a meeting when his secretary handed him the legal notice. "This is outrageous. They think they can go up against us?" Jacob sat in silence, too humiliated to respond. He had known his actions at the charity event were cruel, but he had never imagined it would escalate into something like this. His father had always told him that their family was untouchable, that money could solve any problem. But now, faced with a legal battle, he wasn't so sure. Ryan's family had a similar reaction. His father, a high-powered attorney, immediately began preparing for a legal counterattack, determined to shut the lawsuit down before it could gain traction. But even he knew that this case was going to be complicated. It wasn't just about money, it was about reputation. And the truth was, the public had seen what had happened. They had heard Ethan's speech. Sympathy wasn't on their side. The day of the first court hearing arrived faster than Sarah and Ethan had expected. As they walked into the courthouse, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had never imagined herself in a courtroom, let alone facing off against the wealthy families who had caused them so much pain. But now, standing beside Ethan, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Ms. Hamilton met them in the courthouse lobby, her expression calm and confident. "Are you both ready?" she asked, her eyes scanning their faces. Ethan nodded, his jaw set with determination. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded as well. "Ready," she said, though her voice shook slightly. The courtroom was tense as the case was presented. Ms. Hamilton laid out the facts clearly and succinctly. The years of bullying Ethan had endured, the public humiliation Sarah had faced, and the lasting emotional and psychological harm caused by Jacob and Ryan's actions. She emphasized that this case wasn't just about a single incident. It was about a pattern of behavior, a system of cruelty that had gone unchecked for far too long. Jacob and Ryan's defense attorney, a slick, well-dressed man with a sharp tongue, tried to argue that the boys' actions were merely immature pranks and that there was no malicious intent behind them. He insisted that Jacob and Ryan had apologized publicly and that the lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to tarnish their reputations. But Ms. Hamilton wasn't swayed. She pointed out that the apologies had only come after public pressure and that they had done little to address the real harm done. "These boys didn't just humiliate my clients," she said firmly. "They degraded them. They made them feel less than humans, and that kind of behavior cannot go unpunished." As the hearing continued, it became clear that the court was taking the case seriously. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, listened intently to both sides. She asked pointed questions about the incident at the charity auction, about the years of bullying Ethan had endured, and about the lasting impact on both Ethan and Sarah. When the hearing concluded, the judge announced that the case would move forward to trial. Sarah and Ethan would get their day in court. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was packed. Reporters, parents, students from Hillside, and curious onlookers had all gathered, eager to see how the case would unfold. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah, Ethan, and Ms. Hamilton entered the courtroom. Sarah's heart raced, but she stood tall, determined to see this through. Jacob and Ryan sat with their families on the opposite side of the courtroom. Their faces were pale, their expressions tense. This wasn't the comfortable, untouchable world they were used to. Here, in this courtroom, money and privilege could only go so far. The trial was emotionally charged from the start. Ms. Hamilton began by calling Ethan to the stand, where he recounted his years at Hillside, the taunts, the bullying, the constant feeling of being an outsider. His voice wavered at times, but he held his composure, speaking with the same courage he had shown at graduation. "I've spent years trying to prove that I belong," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough for them. They saw me as less, because my family didn't have the money or the status they did. But my mother taught me that real strength doesn't come from what you have. It comes from who you are, and today I'm standing here because of her." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she listened to her son's testimony. She had known how much pain he had endured, but hearing him speak those words aloud, hearing the strength in his voice, filled her with a deep sense of pride. Next, Ms. Hamilton called Sarah to the stand. Sarah took a deep breath as she approached the witness chair, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she sat down and looked out at the courtroom, she felt a surge of determination. Ms. Hamilton guided her through testimony, asking about the charity auction, about the years of hard work Sarah had put into raising Ethan, and about the humiliation she had felt when Jacob and Ryan pushed her into the mud. Sarah answered each question with quiet dignity, her voice unwavering. "I've never been ashamed of the work I do," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. "I've worked hard to provide for my son, but the way those boys treated me that night, it wasn't just cruel. It was meant to make me feel small, to make me feel like I didn't belong. And no one deserves to be treated that way." The courtroom was silent as Sarah spoke, her words hanging in the air like a weight. Even Jacob and Ryan looked down, unable to meet her gaze. When Ms. Hamilton finished her questioning, the defense tried to paint Sarah as overly sensitive, arguing that the incident was blown out of proportion. But it was clear that the jury wasn't buying it. Sarah's testimony had struck a chord, and there was no denying the emotional impact of what she had endured. After days of testimony, closing arguments, and deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom was filled with a tense, expectant silence as the jury returned to their seats. Sarah and Ethan sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly together. The entire trial had been an emotional whirlwind, and now everything has come down to this moment. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and Sarah, though outwardly composed, could feel her pulse racing as she waited for the jury to speak. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, her voice echoing through the room. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, stood and cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." As the foreman unfolded the piece of paper, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Ethan held his breath, his hand tightening around Sarah's. No matter what happened, they fought for this, together, and that in itself was a victory. In the matter of Sarah Andrews and Ethan Andrews versus Jacob Hill and Ryan Davis, on the charges of defamation, public humiliation, and harassment, the foreman began, his voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty." A collective breath seemed to escape the room all at once. Ethan blinked in disbelief, his body suddenly flooded with relief. They had won. They had won. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. After years of enduring so much, years of being dismissed, belittled, and pushed aside, they had finally been heard. Justice had been served. The judge nodded solemnly at the verdict and addressed the court. Based on the jury's findings, this court orders that both defendants, Jacob Hill and Ryan Davis, are to pay financial restitution for the damages caused to the plaintiffs, Sarah and Ethan Andrews, for emotional suffering, public humiliation, and harassment. Additionally, each defendant will perform 500 hours of community service, specifically in programs aimed at addressing bullying and harassment prevention. The defense attorneys looked stunned, but Jacob and Ryan's faces told a different story: shock, fear, and shame. They sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. For so long, they had believed their wealth and status would shield them from the consequences of their actions. But now they were faced with the reality that money couldn't erase the pain they had caused, nor could it shield them from responsibility. As the judge concluded the session, she glanced at Sarah and Ethan, her expression softening slightly. This case has highlighted the importance of empathy and the damage that bullying and harassment can cause. I hope this serves as a reminder to everyone in this courtroom that actions have consequences, no matter who you are. The courtroom was dismissed, and the murmurs of the crowd grew louder as people began to file out. Sarah turned to Ethan, her eyes glistening with tears of joy and relief. "You did it," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. "We did it." Ethan held her close, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude swelling in his chest. "We fought back, Mom, and we won." The weeks following the trial were a time of adjustment for Jacob and Ryan. Their lives, once filled with privilege and comfort, had taken a drastic turn. The public humiliation they had inflicted on others had come back to haunt them, and now they were the ones being scrutinized and judged. Jacob's family, particularly his father, was furious, not only because they had lost the case, but because the trial had damaged their family's reputation in the business world. Mr. Hill, who had built his real estate empire on the pillars of respectability and professionalism, now found himself fielding questions about his son's behavior at every meeting. "You've embarrassed this family," Mr. Hill had said the night after the verdict. "I thought I raised you better than this, Jacob. Now, you're going to pay for it. Every dollar of that settlement will come out of your trust fund. And community service? You'd better believe you're doing every single hour." For Jacob, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The trust fund he had once counted on for a carefree life after college was now reduced to a fraction of what it had been. But worse than that was the realization that he wasn't untouchable anymore. The court had made it clear that his actions had consequences. and no amount of money could erase the harm he had caused. Ryan, too, faced the harsh realities of the trial's outcome. His parents had always been supportive of him, but the trial had opened their eyes to the person he had become. Mrs. Davis, heartbroken by the revelations during the trial, insisted that Ryan complete his community service at a local anti-bullying organization. "You need to understand the pain you've caused," she had told him tearfully. "I don't know how you lost your way, but this is your chance to find it again." The community service, though initially a source of resentment for both boys, slowly began to change them. Week after week, as they worked with young students who had experienced bullying and harassment, they started to see the impact their actions had had on others. They listened to stories of kids who had been tormented by their peers, and for the first time, they understood what it felt like to be on the other side. Jacob and Ryan hadn't been cruel out of malice. They had been cruel out of ignorance and entitlement. But now, as they faced the consequences of their behavior, they began to reflect on the lives they had led. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but both boys started to grow. With the trial behind them and the settlement secured, Sarah and Ethan finally began to look forward to the future with hope and optimism. For the first time in years, the weight of financial strain had been lifted. Sarah used a portion of the settlement to rent a small storefront in a quiet part of town and turned it into a cafe. Sarah's Sweet Treats Cafe. The cafe became a modest but thriving business, filled with the same sweets Sarah had once sold on street corners, but now they are displayed in glass cases and served with fresh coffee and tea. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, with local families, students, and workers stopping by for a taste of Sarah's signature peanut brittle or a rich chocolate truffle. Ethan often worked at the cafe in the mornings before heading off to college classes. He had been accepted to a prestigious university thanks to his scholarship and academic achievements. With the financial burden eased, he could now focus fully on his studies without the constant worry about how they would make ends meet. "Things are finally looking up, Mom," Ethan said one afternoon as they worked together in the cafe. He was cleaning tables while Sarah chatted with customers at the counter. The sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow across the cafe's cheerful interior. "You've built something incredible here." Sarah smiled warmly at him, her heart full of pride. "It's all thanks to you, Ethan. If you hadn't stood up for us, if you hadn't been so brave, we wouldn't be here." Ethan shook his head, leaning against the counter as he watched his mother work. "No, Mom. This was all you. You raised me, gave me everything. This cafe, it's just a small piece of what you've always deserved." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears as she took his hand. "We did this together, and now we're going to keep moving forward. No more looking back." Months after the trial, Sarah and Ethan sat together on the porch of their small home. The cafe was closed for the evening, and the air was warm with the lingering heat of the day. They sipped iced tea, watching the sun set in the distance, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. It had been a long journey to get here, the lawsuit, the trial, the years of hardship, they had all taken their toll. But now, for the first time in as long as either of them could remember, life felt peaceful. "I still can't believe how far we've come," Sarah said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "There were times I didn't think we'd make it." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "We made it because of you, Mom. You never gave up. Not once." Sarah glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "There were times I wanted to, but every time I looked at you I knew I couldn't. I knew I had to keep going." Ethan looked down at his hands, the weight of everything they had been through settling over him like a blanket. "I wish I had stood up for you sooner. I wish I hadn't been so afraid." Sarah shook her head, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't regret anything, Ethan. You did what you could, when you could, and when the time came, you were brave. You stood up not just for me, but for yourself. You showed everyone who you really are. And I couldn't be prouder." Ethan swallowed hard. his eyes misting over. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart," Sarah replied, her voice filled with warmth and love. "Always." A year had passed since the trial, and life for Sarah and Ethan had settled into a new rhythm. The cafe was thriving, Ethan was excelling at university, and for the first time in years, they had a sense of security and peace. One bright afternoon, as Sarah prepared to close up the cafe for the day, a familiar figure walked through the door. It was Ryan Davis. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, memories of the trial flashing through her mind. She hadn't seen Ryan since the courtroom, and part of her wasn't sure what to expect. Ryan approached the counter, his posture awkward, his face pale with nervousness. He had changed over the past year. His once cocky demeanor had softened, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. "Hi, Mrs. Andrews," Ryan said, his voice quiet. I wanted to stop by and apologize properly." Sarah blinked, her surprise evident. "Ryan, I know it's been a long time," Ryan continued, shifting uncomfortably, "but I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of reflecting, and I'm really sorry for everything, for what I did to Ethan, and for what I did to you." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that." Ryan swallowed, his relief palpable. "I'm working at an anti-bullying program now, helping kids who've been through what Ethan went through. I hope one day I can make up for what I did." Sarah's heart softened. She could see the sincerity in Ryan's eyes, and for the first time she felt a sense of closure. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but in that moment, she knew it was the right thing. "I hope you do too," Sarah said kindly. "It's never too late to change." Ryan gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you. Really." As Ryan left the cafe, Sarah watched him go, feeling a weight lift from her chest. She had fought hard for justice, but in the end, forgiveness was what brought her peace. 2 years later, Ethan stood on the campus of his university, watching as students passed by, each heading toward their own futures. He had come a long way from the boy who had once felt out of place, from the boy who had hidden his struggles and endured cruelty in silence. Now, he knew his worth. He knew what he was capable of. And most importantly, he knew that the future was full of possibilities. As he walked across the quad, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Cafe's busy today. Everyone's asking for your peanut brittle recipe again. I keep telling them, it's top secret. Can't wait to see you for dinner. Love you." Ethan smiled, typing a quick reply. "Love you too, Mom. See you tonight." With a sense of purpose and peace, Ethan continued walking, the weight of the past finally behind him. He had fought for himself, for his mother, and for their future. And now together they were unstoppable. Thank you so much for watching this story. If you enjoyed the journey of Sarah and Ethan, please don't forget to like this story, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of courage, resilience, and hope every day. Let me know if you have any suggestions or ideas for future stories. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. See you in the next story.